Let's outline the current write-ups version of slicing, dicing, shooting, puncturing, killing, and otherwise gruesome things in Champions now. Like everybody who's worked with these rules, I've struggled with the rather careful setup in the original rules and recognized just where they have to be changed, but also exactly how is tricky because everything kind of works together. All the different ways to defend, the different kinds of damage, the different advantages, all those things. So I decided to pull it all apart and make everything separate. There is no dedicated killing attack power. Instead, there are a whole bunch of crisscrossing advantages to customize your version of killing or otherwise nasty for damage. And let's run them down. The most obvious, well, actually, the not quite as obvious, for attacks that don't do body damage that you still roll dice for. I've added an advantage that permits them to do body damage. So, woohoo, now instead of making things less dangerous, I'm making it more dangerous by letting your drain or your entangle do damage with body damage. Kind of nice to be able to say the entangle's got spikes on it, and defenses are lower in Champions now, so 6 points or something is actually kind of dangerous if you're not careful. Well, let's take a look at the next one. That was lethal. And then here's the biggie, piercing. Piercing is the one that says body damage goes through ordinary defenses. It ignores defenses that are not resistant. So that's it right there. That's the big shift in the rules. This damage just goes right through ordinary defenses of the body damage alone. So I pulled that apart, the stun versus the body. So piercing just lets the body damage go through. Now, then you have, borrowing an older term for a slightly different meaning, we have no normal defense, which applies to stun damage going through all but resistant defenses. So if you want both kinds of damage to go through non-resistant defenses, then you need to have both of those advantages. What else? Yes, one more, destructive. Destructive is important because the default in Champions now is that all damage comes back with recoveries, which is really generous. Everyone thinks of body damage as being injury, so it's not going to come back with recoveries. But to get it to that status, you have to buy it as destructive. So that's 3 advantages to restore the old school killing attack. You need it to be piercing, and you need it to be destructive. And if it didn't do body before, then you need it to be lethal in the first place. So that's that. What else are involved? We need to think about these in conjunction with ego-based attacks. And we also need to think about this in conjunction with striking, because right now it's set up to all operate off of blast for the most part. And blast is ranged. So to convert it into a hand attack, you have to make it strike with that advantage. Okay, so with all those kind of in front of us, how do we put it together? Let's take the easiest example where we just take an ordinary blast and we make it piercing and we make it destructive and we add the no normal defense and we take the option, which is the less expensive option, that resistant defenses will stop the damage ordinarily. And so for that stun damage. So far so good. We now have the question, as currently in the document, that no normal defense doesn't add endurance. And I'm considering making it add endurance. And so in the little document that I've attached to this blog post, you will see that I've put that option there all in red. So I don't care which way you play test it, just as long as you know which one. So there we go. Piercing, destructive, plus no normal defense at the half advantage that resistant defenses will stop it. Put that on your blast, and you have basically your death ray. Now, what about counting that damage again? You're counting stun and body ordinarily. The old killing attack mode of counting the damage directly off the pips, that's gone. You're just counting the body that's rolled. And you're thinking, wait a minute, that's only going to give me 2 or 3 body. Well, no, you're thinking like the old killing attacks. Remember, this is blast, 1 die 6 per 5 points before advantages. So therefore, you are shooting 4 big handfuls of dice, just like an ordinary attack, and counting the body. So So far, so good. What next? Let's take a look at it. Let's take an example. Horrible Death Blast. Body and stun go through non-resistant defenses. It's a ranged attack, and the damage doesn't recover. So we'll make it 6d6, which is, if you roll 6 body on the 6 dice, most likely, then you will end up just blowing right through the resistant defenses with those. And what else? The base is 30 points for 6 dice of blast. And then if you add up all of those advantages, that's 2.5 points worth of multiplier points worth of advantages. So multiply 30 times 3.5, and it's going to cost 105 points. Before limitations, of course, but still 105 points. If you look at the way I've set up the frameworks and things like that, you're going to say, wait a minute, I can't just buy it down with 1 million limitations. I mean, we need to have a cap, the capacity of 105 points at least on some of these pools to do that. That's a substantial chunk of character, especially when you consider the ratio concept, and that I consider this a very hard limit. Do not go over 120 for a starting player character, and only go over a ratio of 120 for later characters. Well, I would advise not to do it. Under those circumstances, if you get a power this big and you buy its real cost down with limitations, you've jacked up that ratio substantially and don't have a lot of room in that character to save other points that way at all. So it becomes a very signature thing for the character, and that starts to make sense to me. Okay, what are some other examples? Let's take before we go there, let's remember that defenses are lower typically in Champions now. So if you're going to be throwing around a 12d6 blast, a very, very powerful blast, not modified even, none of this killy stuff on there, you may well actually be doing some damage. I had a grown villain, grown up tall, big villain, backhand swat a hero in last week's game, and given various different modifications of the moment, and the fact that he swatted him into a watchtower, the hero ended up taking a substantial amount of damage, and even with his force field, took some body damage. So it was actually kind of that's right, the first impact stunned him, and so that turned off the force field, and then that means he crashed into the watchtower without it, and so then that ensuing damage, he only had his basic defenses, if any, to defend him, and he ended up taking 5 or 6 body. So watch out. In Champions now, body's going to be coming to you sometimes much more often than it did using the original rules. So these smaller amounts of damage are not small after all. Everything's kind of scaled down slightly in those terms. All right, what other applications can we think of for these advantages? If we want, oh yes, of course. I mean, what about Clawman? I mean, we have to account for that. What are we looking at there? I'm going to think about the piercing and the destructive and the no normal defense, just as before, just as we just did for the blast. And the only thing that makes it Clawman is the strike advantage. Now, strike comes in 2 forms. The lesser form, where the attached power replaces any strength-based punch damage that the hero is going to do, or whether it adds to it, which is more expensive. In this case, we're talking about an attack that replaces the punching damage, because we're saying the Claws are the main thing. So what we get is the same array, piercing at 1, destructive at 1, no normal defense at half, and putting in the strike at this level is only 1/4. That's going to come to, well, again, let's start with the 66. 30 points. Now we're going to multiply that by 3.75, which gets us up to 112.5 points. So you're seeing it's comparable. I mean, it's a little bit more expensive than the previous one because it's strike and based on these more manipulable melee things, but it's pretty substantial. What about endurance cost? Looking at our Ray Blast and our Clawy Strike as sort of our baselines, what sort of endurance are we talking about at this 6x6 level, which is going to do about 6 points or so of this piercing destructive damage. And we see that for the Ray Blast one, that as written in the rules you have, it would cost 12 endurance. If you make no normal defense cost endurance, which I am really kind of tending to lean toward at the moment, then it would cost 15 endurance. In Champions Now, that's a bite. That's a healthy bite out of your endurance, and a couple of zots like that, a little bit of running around, and you're thinking about a recovery pretty soon, which is just how I want it. Now, the same thing goes for the Clawy Strike, because that would be either 13 endurance as written, or if we make the no normal defense cost endurance, then that would be 17 points of endurance. And I'm good with those numbers. They're comparable to other attacks that rack up into that level of danger using the other powers. Well, good enough. Let's take a look at a couple of nuances. Okay, one thing that is also done in this version of the rules is to almost entirely remove that separate track between mentally damaging attacks and physically damaging attacks. There is the advantage ego-based, but there isn't an ego blast power. So you just have to get a blast. And all ego-based lets you do is use your ego combat value to hit with, and it's defended against the same way. It does not bypass defenses, the physical defenses. It is merely the attack is ego-based. That doesn't mean the damage bypasses all that other stuff. You have to buy that separately. And we have that. That's that no normal defense thing. And in this case, I'm going to go with the more expensive version of no normal defense. So its value is 1 instead of 1/2. And that means the damage is fully stopped if you have ego defense, but otherwise nothing stops it. So now we're looking kind of at our classic ego blast. We've got blast, ego-based, and nothing stops it. What's a little different in these rules is that if you have any ego defense, it'll shut that down. Let's take a look at making such an attack lethal, which is quite expensive in the old rules and should be expensive here, but I also didn't want it to be impossible. It ends up being kind of interesting and maybe even a little generous. Another reason for taking that no normal defense endurance cost into play. Well, let's take a look at it, run it all down. First of all, we have blast, and we have to make it a mental blast by making it ego-based. We're going to give it the no normal defense that I just described, which means that only ego defense stops the stun. Now, the ego-based attack advantage has already removed body damage from the blast. That's part of it. Well, now we put it back with the lethal advantage, and then we can make this body damage that we have acquired all of a sudden, both piercing and destructive, at 6d6, which would mean about 6 body damage. It would cost baseline of 30 points, and with all these advantages, it starts looking kind of insane. That's 4.5 points of advantages. So multiplying it by 5.5, that's going to, for your 6x6 thing, this is 165 points. It's going to cost 12 endurance, or if you use the multiplier that I'm recommending at the moment, 18. So again, it's priced through the roof, and such things are going to be a lot more common as the equivalent of 1d6 killing in the old rules, which would be down around, a couple dice of blast, not 6. So you can get these mind killer strikes, but they're going to be painful. And notice it's destructive damage. I mean, the stun and body aren't coming back from these hits. So it's kind of worth the price, but if you think you can just get a power that, you just look at somebody and boom, they, suddenly they blow up. No, even at 66, which isn't going to kill somebody outright, that's going to be costing this pretty intense number of points. But doable, completely doable. There's one other nuance to this, which is with the new lethal advantage, you can put body damage into such powers as siphon, which is my blanket term for draining and transfer. You can put them on entangles. And anyway, it's kind of cool. You can make these things do body damage. If you want them to that body damage to go through resistant defenses, then you have to make it piercing. If you want that damage to last, then you need it to be destructive. So it's a pretty straightforward combination to make, an ouchie entangle into a deadly one. There are other things you may think of as well. One of the other advantages is called persistent, where the effect actually hits again and again and again. And so if you really want like the death grab that kills you as it basically squeezes or, spikes you to death or poisons you or whatever it is, then you've got the rules to do this. It is reasonably expensive, but it's in the same zone as what we were talking about. If you were to get something at the same point value, which is 30 points, that would be 3 dice 6 of entangle. If you're saying, well, wait a minute, that's only like 3 body, right? That's not very much. Aha. But since the base cost of entangle is 10 points for a die 6, which is twice the base cost, you multiply by 2. So when you roll the dice for entangle, you count the body, multiply it by 2, and that's how much damage it'll do in terms of body. So, reasonably nasty. I'm good with that. You do have to consider that the dice you're rolling are a little tricky in this regard. I was talking just now about draining something that's 1 for 1, like strength or stun. When you're draining things that cost differently, like endurance or ego or dexterity or something like that, then you need to be careful that the multiplier that you're using is appropriate for maintaining the 5 points per die effect, and make sure that you're not, counting way more body than you're supposed to or something like that. That's kind of one of these little edge case situations. I'm looking at that and going, that's kind of complicated. Maybe we'll make that more elegant when we find out how it works in play. But right now, with this set of advantages, I think that you can craft your deadly or partly deadly attack into precisely the form you want. And I also think that the point costs are quite high and the endurance costs are high, significant, but without being, it's not going to drop you in your tracks. You're not going to like get off one bolt of one of these things and then just fall face first into the dirt. You have enough that it's going to matter. If you're going to hit somebody with an attack that hurts them like this, then the endurance requirement is high, but it's not prohibitive. So all of that is my hope, and we don't know how it's going to work all that well yet, do we? I'm not claiming this is a Swiss watch. This needs to happen in play. We need to see whether the costs for resistant defenses just make all of this parsing meaningless. If everyone's just bouncing all this stuff off of them, no matter what anybody does with all these points, well, we need to find out. If we find that, one of these combinations is just insane, that, somebody drops everybody left and right and there's bodies everywhere and all the rest of it, then we need to take a look and see how that combo got that way. So there's plenty to find out, and there's no way we can make a huge spreadsheet and just run it all abstractly and then just know. No, we've got to see what real humans do with it in the moment and find out. So encourage this sort of thing among your player characters. You wouldn't really expect somebody to say that, right? Hooray, blood, carnage, let's do it, slaughter. Well, try it out. I don't think it'll be quite that gruesome. And I think the effects will go very, very far to characterize heroes in ways that matter ethically and can make for more fun. Check it out and let me know how it goes.